Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. I hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering part 2 of the level 2 spells tier list, so including the most important spell in the game, so let's just jump right in. I'm recording this before posting part 1, so if there's any corrections that I want to make based on the valuable feedback that I get in the comments, we'll jump in for those in the beginning of the next episode of this video series. But for now, let's just cover the level 2 spells, starting with Hold Person. Hold Person is one of the spells that suffers the most in Baldur's Gate from a rules change made between Tabletop 5th edition D&D and Baldur's Gate 3. That rules change is actually not specifically to the spell, but in general to how save ends effects work in Baldur's Gate. In tabletop D&D, when you cast Hold Person, the enemy makes a saving throw, and if they fail that save, they skip their next turn, and then at the end of their turn they get a save to try to break out of the effect. In Baldur's Gate 3, every effect that lasts for a character a number of turns, or that a character gets to save against, happens at the beginning of their turn. So in order for Hold Person to actually cost an enemy a turn, they need to fail 2 saving throws in a row in order for them to lose their turn, because they get a save when you first cast the spell, and then they get another save at the beginning of their turn, and if they pass that save, they just act normally. This means that this spell is significantly worse than it is in tabletop. It's still not the complete wash, because it's a very powerful spell in tabletop. The ability to just take an enemy out of the fight completely is, of course, extremely powerful. Most of the more dangerous enemies in the game are persons, and so you will be able to target them, because this spell can target any humanoid. You need Hold Monster for non-humanoid enemies, but a lot of the most dangerous enemies in the game will be humanoid anyways, so you don't need to worry about targeting restrictions with Hold Person. The real thing that holds this back is just that they need to fail 2 saving throws. You can also upcast this spell to target more enemies, which is of course very powerful as well. But as a concentration disable that requires 2 saves to actually work, this spell really does suffer as a result of that rules change. It targets Wisdom, which means that you can pretty reliably get enemies to fail it the first time, because a lot of enemies that you want to paralyze have low Wisdom saves. And it does have the Rider effect that enemies who are paralyzed by this, you get guaranteed critical hits against if you're close to them. That is very, very powerful. Guaranteed critical hits are extraordinarily powerful for a number of reasons, and of course, benefit some classes, especially like paladins and so on. But overall, that challenge of them having to fail 2 saving throws bumps Hold Person down quite a bit. It would be, I think, an S tier spell if it used the 5th edition tabletop rules. As it's implemented in Baldur's Gate, I'm going to put it in B tier, because the critical hit rider is still very useful and is still just a very powerful effect, but the fact that you have to make them fail 2 saves for it does hold this spell back. You can, of course, cheese save DCs using the Arcane Acuity helmets or whatever and make enemies automatically fail, and if you're doing that, then, of course, the spell is more powerful than command or other equivalent disable spells, because you also get the critical hits. So if you have a specific build that has save DCs that enemies can never pass, then it doesn't matter that they have to make 2 saves. Otherwise, I think you're just better off preparing command in almost every circumstance, because the likelihood that an enemy fails 3 saves in a row is pretty low. This takes your concentration, so it's rarely going to cost them more than 1 turn. This takes your concentration and requires 2 saves before it costs them even a single turn. Invisibility. Invisibility turns you invisible. You gain complete immunity to enemy targeting for the most part, and you attack with advantage for the first time. As soon as you attack, you lose invisibility, but you can or interact with most objects, so like you can't usually go through doors without breaking invisibility. And you can't take damage or cast spells or enter a lot of effects. Many specific effects will break invisibility as well. A lot of ground surfaces will break invisibility. That said, this is, of course, a very powerful effect. Being unable to be targeted by most enemies and gaining advantage on your first attack is very powerful. The ease with which you can enter stealth in this game, because enemies will never stealth check you when you are not in their vision cone definitely decreases the utility of this spell. And of course, it's most useful in general for Dwergar who get it for free rather than having to spend spell resources on it. Outside of that use case where you aren't getting it for free and actually having to spend a level 2 spell on invisibility, there's definitely some encounters where it comes up and things where you want to like sneak past guards or whatever. It's very useful for those things. But overall, this is not going to be one that's going to give you a huge advantage in combat, so I'm going to put it in C tier. Knock. Knock opens a lock. No questions asked except for the most important locks in the game, or the most difficult locks in the game, which are immune to knock. But no matter whether you have lockpicks or a sleight of hand user in your party, no matter how difficult the lock is, knock will just open it. A level 2 spell completely removes the need for a lockpicker in your party for the most part. Knock is a classic spell. It's a classic example of bad design in tabletop, by the way. This is going to be a slight bit of a tangent, but this is one of the worst designed spells in the entirety of Dungeons & Dragons. The reason for that is that picking locks is cool and thematic and important for stories and stuff, and it becomes a core component of, like, people who are playing a rogue in tabletop want to be able to pick locks and be the cool second story man and whatever, doing all the cool things that you would expect a rogue to do. So having a floofy wizard who's never seen a lock in his life have a button that just says, I open that and with no trouble at all, is very poor design and leads to very poor moments in tabletop gameplay. And a lot of groups actually pretend this spell doesn't exist because it's so annoying for the player who's actually built a character who can pick locks. Anyways, tangent over. In Baldur's Gate, this spell is primarily used if you aren't bringing a lockpicker, because the ease of gaining inspiration and the fact that you never have to lockpick under a time limit or anything, and the ease of finding thieving kits in order to retry locks, and the fact that you can just retry, you never accidentally like break off your lockpick in a lock and prevent it from being opened, which is something that could happen in tabletop D&D. You can't ruin a lock forever with a bad roll or anything like that. It means that knock just isn't particularly useful for most parties. It's going to be very easy to open almost every lock that you want to, and most locks in the game just give you some assorted random loot, which you can usually just go without. There's a couple locks that are important to pick, but for the most part, you'll be able to do that just using inspiration and rerolls, even if you don't have a dedicated sleight of hand user. And most parties are going to have some high dexterity character who can bring sleight of hand. So we'll put knock in marginal tier for a party that doesn't have those effects, but for the most part, I think you're going to be better off just using sleight of hand. Lesser Restoration. Lesser Restoration is a melee range spell that just cures a condition from an ally, or I guess an enemy, technically. You can cure disease, poison, paralysis, or blind. All of those are very dangerous conditions that you really do want to cure, and that's even aside from the fact that you have a party member who inflicts a disease on your fellow party members once per day, if you're using him. You can use Lesser Restoration to clear Astarion's Bloodless condition, which makes it a mandatory pick for any party with Astarion in general, so while you'll usually get that from an item, even outside of that use case is very important. Even outside of that use case, this is still a good spell to have in your arsenal. It's not going to be something you're going to prepare for every fight, or something that you'll prepare sort of like as you're in your first 5 spells, because it's not one that you're going to cast every fight, but when you want it, you'll be so glad you have it, because getting paralyzed or something, having a panic button that can break you out of these devastating crowd control conditions is very useful. Generally speaking, I think you're going to be better off using amulets and so on, but for this spell, but this is absolutely something that you can prepare as your last spell if you're just looking to fill out your spellbook, and it will come up pretty frequently and be very reasonably useful, so we're going to put it in B tier and say that it is useful. Magic Weapon. Magic Weapon is a spell that, conversely to Hold Person, benefits very strongly from a rules change from Tabletop to Baldur's Gate. In tabletop 5th edition, Magic Weapon can't be used on weapons that already have an enhancement bonus, or rather, if you cast it at a higher level, it'll replace the enhancement bonus. In Baldur's Gate, it adds to the enhancement bonus. So Magic Weapon is a day-long concentration spell that adds +1 to your attacks and damage with a weapon, +2 if you cast it with a level 4 spell slot, or +3 if you cast it with a level 6 spell slot. This is a non-trivial bonus. Adding +1 to your attacks and damage is going to add up to a lot of extra damage over the course of the day, and it stacks with existing weapon enchantments. So you can take a legendary +3 weapon and turn it into a super legendary +4 weapon, or even into an ultra epic most legendary possible +6 weapon if you want to use a level 6 spell slot on it. Being concentration and lasting the entire day is what still holds this spell back, but that rules change alone makes it significantly better than its tabletop version, and is something I actually didn't realize. I was so used to this being a completely useless spell from tabletop that I was just, I ignored it for many hours into playing the game before I realized it actually stacked with existing enhancement bonuses in Baldur's Gate. There are some builds that actually will want to use this. In particular, an Eldritch Knight, who doesn't generally have better things to concentrate on, is going to benefit pretty strongly from just having Magic Weapon up. You will probably not lose concentration very easily, because you will have high Constitution and Constitution save proficiency, and you're going to be making weapon attacks because you're an Eldritch Knight, and you can benefit very strongly from that. Archers also benefit pretty strongly from Magic Weapon, so because they are unlikely to be hit, so you can use this on your own weapons, and while you will often prefer to be concentrating on haste or something like that if you have caster levels on an archer, this is still a totally reasonable spell to concentrate on. It lasts all day, takes a second level spell slot, which are, if you're an Eldritch Knight in particular, not incredibly valuable for you, and this will just be a really solid benefit that you can get throughout the day. Because it's only useful for 1 or maybe 2 builds, I'm going to put it in C tier, but this is actually a spell that's much better than it looks like at first glance for those characters, and one that I kind of slept on, and now that I'm doing this tier list, I think actually deserves a little more of a look than I had initially given it. Melf's Acid Arrow, a spell that you can tell was named before the internet. Melf's Acid Arrow is an attack spell. It's a 60-foot range attack roll spell, so targeting armor class, that is unique among attack roll spells in that if it misses, you still get damage. Normally that's something that you only get on saving throws, but the 4d4 acid damage, you still get half of it even if you miss with the spell. It also, if you hit with the spell, does an additional 2d4 acid damage at the end of the creature's next turn. But again, in Baldur's Gate, that's actually the start of the creature's next turn, which I find kind of annoying that all of the spell descriptions are just wrong because everything happens at the start of the turn and not at the end of the turn. So this gives you 6d6 of initial acid damage for an average of 15 damage, which is a pretty weak amount of damage for a level 2 spell slot, but it also creates an acid pool, which is relevant because that reduces a creature's armor class by 2. This has some anti-synergy, though, because you have to make an armor class targeting attack first in order to then reduce enemy armor class. An effect that reduced enemy armor class would be much more useful on a spell that targeted something that wasn't armor class, so that you wouldn't have to target a presumably fairly high AC that you're trying to reduce in order to then reduce it. So you're pretty likely against most targets you'd want the acid effect against to miss with your first casting of Melf's Acid Arrow, in which case it does only half of the 4d4 and none of the subsequent burn damage. This makes it an extremely weak damaging spell. It's barely better than casting an acid chromatic orb, which does the same acid pool and only very slightly less damage for a level 1 spell instead of a level 2 spell, can be upcast to deal only 1 fewer damage than Melf's Acid Arrow, so you would pretty much never prepare this because you could always cast a level 2 chromatic orb. And the rider effect is mediocre, the damage is bad, this is just a bad spell all around, don't prepare it. It really suffers something that a lot of damage spells suffer from, which is that it's better to just cast an upcasted level 1 version, an upcasted version of a level 1 spell, rather than casting a level 2 or higher spell. It also scales. One thing that Melf's Acid Arrow does have going for it is that it does actually scale reasonably well with upcasted levels. You get an additional 2d4 on your impact damage and 1d4 on your extra damage, so it's a 3d4 of scaling per spell level, which is not a terrible scaling. In fact, I think that's one of the best level scaling spells in the game in terms of extra damage gained. 3d4 is better than, say, Witch Bolt's 1d12 or Fireball's 2d6. So it's going to scale reasonably well with levels, but for single target damage at higher levels, you have way better options. And also, for single target damage, you have way better options at this level of spell already. So you should just never use this spell. Mirror Image. Mirror Image is an action. It's a non-concentration buff that lasts for 10 turns. You cast it on yourself, and it gives you 3 mirror images, 3 illusions of yourself, each of which, while active, increases your armor class by 3. So you get 9 AC when you cast this spell, which is a lot. That's going to basically guarantee that the next attack against you misses. However, every time an attack against you misses, you lose one of the mirror images. So the first attack against you will be made with plus 9 AC, second attack plus 6, third attack plus 3, assuming that they all miss. That's still pretty useful. For dedicated spellcasters, this is not going to be something that you want to spend spell slots on going into a combat, but plus 9 AC is a lot. And so there are some characters that can actually benefit pretty strongly from casting Mirror Image. Characters in particular that want to actually be trading blows in melee, so once again, this is a spell that is primarily useful for Eldritch Knights. There's also another class that benefits very strongly from this, because you can get this on Circle of the Land Druid, and Circle of the Land Druid will want to be wild-shaped and probably concentrating on another spell. So if you have enough time to prepare before a difficult fight, you can cast Mirror Image and cast whatever spell you want to be concentrating on, and then Wild Shape, still have a bunch of turns of Mirror Image, and this is very likely to stop the first few attacks from hitting your Wild Shape, which means that you're going to get more turns of concentrating on Flaming Sphere, or whatever higher level concentration spell you're using for that fight, haste, etc. Because it's not concentration, this stacks very well just with other buff spells as well. So Mirror Image can actually be pretty strong, and is a spell that, again, useful for only some classes, so we're going to put it in C tier, but definitely a worthy option, in particular for Land Druids and Eldritch Knights, and something that you should keep an eye on, whether it can be useful in a certain fight. Just almost fully preventing 2 attacks against you, plus 9 AC and then plus 6 AC, is a lot. On an Eldritch Knight, this can send your AC into the stratosphere, because you can have Mirror Image plus shield, plus being in full armor and wearing and using an actual shield. So you can have something like 35 AC on this character when you use a Mirror Image. That means you're basically immune to physical attacks for the first couple attacks in a fight, and usually the first couple attacks in a fight are the only ones that actually matter, because by the time the enemies have taken a couple turns, you'll have beaten the crap out of them and they won't be able to do anything anymore. So I think that Mirror Image actually does have a place. It's a spell that often I think people underrate, and maybe I'm underrating it by putting it in C tier, but because it's only useful for a couple builds, I think it belongs there as well. Misty Step. Misty Step is, here's the spoiler, the single most important spell in the game. Every character should have access to Misty Step, because it does so many important things for your characters. One, it's strategically critical. Mobility is king in a game like Dungeons & Dragons that's mostly about alpha striking, and I guess here's how you can think of D&D combat. D&D combat is an exercise in reducing the number of relevant actions that your opponents take as much as possible. That's the only goal of pretty much any of these spells. You can do that in several ways. One is by removing their ability to act with command, or just by enough damage. Dead creatures can't act, and so that's accomplished your strategic goal. But another is reducing the relevancy of their action by positioning yourself in such a way that they can't do anything. The easiest way is just to be out of range or up on a cliff where a melee character can't act. Misty Step lets you do that. Misty Step also makes up for mistakes. If you have made an error and aren't where you want to be, Misty Step fixes that. No questions, no problems, you just leave. So that those two things by themselves are ridiculously powerful. It also lets you just fully overcome certain encounters. You know, you have to like get over a bridge or across whatever, past a wall. Misty Step solves all of those problems, and there's several encounters in the game where that's useful, or puzzles in the game that Misty Step just lets you skip completely. People will sometimes say you can get it from items, so you don't need to have it prepared, and those people are dumb and wrong. More castings of Misty Step is better. S tier spell. I could go on and on and on, but I think you get the idea. Moonbeam. Moonbeam is actually a very deceptive spell because it is a concentration spell that creates an area on the ground where enemies take 2d10 radiant damage with a constitution save for half. The AoE is tiny, so the chances of hitting multiple enemies with it are pretty low actually, unless they're extremely tightly packed or unless you can reposition them using shoves or any other repositioning tool that's available to you. As a druid, of course, you also potentially have Thorn Whip, which you can use to pull enemies into it, doing the damage. Just like Cloud of Daggers, because this is an effect that goes on the ground, enemies take the damage when they enter it, or when you cast it, and at the start of their turn. So you get to double dip on the 2d10 radiant damage on the first turn that you put Moonbeam up. It's a concentration spell like Cloud of Daggers, so it does have that downside, but it's actually secretly the single best single target damage spell available at level 2. Moonbeam will do 4d10 damage for an average damage of 22. Compare that to Scorching Ray's 66 for an average damage of 21, or Cloud of Daggers 8d4 for an average damage of 20. They all go down from there. Moonbeam is actually the best damaging action available to you with a level 2 spell slot. That is not nothing, and of course you can continue to use it later on in the fight. It gives you an action, as long as you are concentrating on the Moonbeam, to move the Moonbeam up to 60 feet. Again, when you move it over an enemy, they take the damage, and then they'll take the damage again at the start of their turn, allowing you to double dip more in future rounds. So that, compared to Cloud of Daggers, you are able to both trigger it more reliably, because you can move it after you cast it, and double dip on the damage more often. Now, unfortunately, it does suffer because it has a constitution save for half. So unlike Cloud of Daggers, the average damage is going to be lower because enemies won't always fail the save. But from a sort of theoretical standpoint, Moonbeam is the highest single target damage available in the game. This also, as a level 2 spell. Moonbeam also does suffer a little bit from a rules change from Tabletop 5th Edition to Baldur's Gate, because in Tabletop 5e, it's a mandatory pick on druids because it's one of the best things to concentrate on while you're wild-shaped. In Baldur's Gate 3, unfortunately, you can't move the beam after you cast it when you're in wild shape, because any spells that give you subsequent spell actions, like Heat Metal, like Moonbeam, all can't be used while wild-shaped, and so lose a significant amount of value compared to their counterparts in Tabletop 5th Edition. That being said, the fact that this spell just does so much damage, and it's really good to concentrate on when you are not in wild shape, I think means that it is quite a bit better than it might look at first glance as just a damaging spell. It also has a couple weird interactions because it doesn't count as damage from the actual creature, so it won't like apply radiating orbs or stuff like that, which would be very good if you could manage to get it to do that, because that would be a very consistent source of radiant damage. It's slightly less consistent damage than Cloud of Daggers, but I think still fills exactly the same role for a druid as just being an extremely reliable source of a lot of damage. You won't get multiple hits with it as often, so unlike Cloud of Daggers, which will probably actually do 16d4 of damage because you can hit 2 enemies with it usually, Moonbeam is usually only going to hit 1 enemy and end up doing less total damage overall. But just as a very powerful single damaging spell, I'm going to put it in A tier. I think you could bump this up to S tier, and maybe for a Spore Druid it would be S tier, but the fact that there's probably better things to concentrate on for druids who are wild shaping, as well as the slightly less reliable damage than compared to Cloud of Daggers, do hurt the spell a little bit, but Still an excellent spell that every druid should bring. Great damage and secretly the best damaging spell at level 2. Pass Without Trace. Pass Without Trace gives you plus 10 to your stealth checks. It's a concentration spell that lasts all day. Which is pretty nice because usually you're going to be using this on a character that won't take damage and lose concentration. Now, in Baldur's Gate, you don't really make stealth checks. The only times you're going to make stealth checks are in lightly obscured areas, where you are passing through enemy vision cones, but most of the time you can just not pass through enemy vision cones, and it's totally fine. You will rarely make stealth checks. The time when Pass Without Trace does come up is if you have greater invisibility also, which means you need at least 2 characters, because those are both concentration spells. Greater invisibility lets you make attacks freely without entering combat or being seen by enemies, as long as you keep passing stealth checks in increasing difficulty. Pass Without Trace combos with that to let you make 5-10 attacks outside of combat before combat ever starts, ending encounters before they ever begin. This is probably the single most broken strategy in the game, and this is a core component of it. I'm going to put it in C tier because it's involved in one extremely broken strategy, but otherwise is mostly useless. I wouldn't recommend casting this spell just for its general utility, just instead simply don't enter enemy vision cones and you'll never have to make a stealth check, which you can very easily arrange by using Minor Illusion and so on to reposition enemies. But for that use case alone, it's just so powerful. Phantasmal Force. Phantasmal Force is a concentration spell available to bards, sorcerers, and wizards and warlocks, and basically the enemies make an intelligence saving throw, which is a rare save, rare save to target, but all it does is 1d6 damage every turn. There is no, you can't even upcast it for additional damage. It just does 1d6 psychic damage every turn. The way this spell works in tabletop, it will make them like actually think there's an enemy there and they'll target attacks against it. In Baldur's Gate, it just has the damage component, so it's completely and totally useless. 1d6 of damage is a shameful amount of damage, and Phantasmal Force should be embarrassed. Prayer of Healing. Prayer of Healing is an out-of-combat healing spell. You can only use it when out of combat, and it just does 2d8, excuse me, healing plus your spellcasting modifier to every character in the AoE. It will affect summons as long as they're not undead, so it's a good way to restore health to your summons. Just a fairly efficient way to heal outside of combat. More efficient than casting Cure Wounds or whatever. But this game is very generous with short rests and also potions, and so I wouldn't recommend preparing Prayer of Healing. I suppose it could come up in some encounters if you're like out of short rests and really don't want a long rest, because of story reasons, or you're going through a dungeon or whatever and don't want to spend a bunch of potions. But the amount of healing that you get from it is fairly marginal compared to just chugging potions, which you will have so many of throughout the game that it's not important to conserve those as a resource. So in the context of Baldur's Gate, Prayer of Healing is a D tier spell. Protection from Poison. Protection from Poison is another day-long spell. This one is not concentration, though, which makes it pretty interesting already. Just any day-long buff that's not concentration is always worth looking at, because it can be a marginal benefit. You can get this from a camp follower, which is probably the best way to use it, because it's not concentration, so they can just spend their level 2 spell slots casting it on your active party and stay at home. I'm going to be rating this, like with most of the camp follower spells, assuming that you're actually using your party's spell slots for it, rather than just getting it for free. And in that case, Protection from Poison will come up in some encounters. It gives you advantage on saving throws against being poisoned and resistance to poison damage. I think there's like a couple encounters in the game where you are going to take a lot of poison damage, and it's useful there. The fact that it's not concentration is nice. Not an incredibly powerful spell, but for the encounters where it matters, it does matter. I think that overall this is on the weakest end of C tier. I think just because it comes up in so few encounters, poison resistance is fairly easy to get in other ways as well. But you know, there are encounters where it will come up and where it will be a good use of a level 2 spell slot, usually later in the game. This isn't something you should ever have at level 2, but we're going to put it in C tier for now. Ray of Enfeeblement. Ray of Enfeeblement is a what's called a save or suck spell that uses both an attack roll and a saving throw to apply against enemies. If you hit them, they get a Constitution save. It takes your concentration, and if they fail the save, they do half damage with weapon attacks that use strength. That is a very powerful effect, but the likelihood of applying it is so low, and the enemies that you'd actually want to hit with it will all have great constitutions, so the chances of actually applying it are very poor. This is a powerful effect, so it's worth looking at, but you just will never reliably land it, and if you are going to reliably land this spell, why are you not using Hold Person, why are you not using Command, etc.? There's just better options if you're going to do a spell that they can end with a save, and that just doesn't the crowd control condition just isn't as powerful as just stopping them from acting, of which there are several spells at this level that just stop them from acting. Half damage is probably better than disadvantage, so it's a little better of an effect than blind or heat metal, but it's just so much less reliable to land than those, and those have other utility as well, that Ray of Enfeeblement is just not a spell that you should ever prepare. D tier spell. Scorching Ray. Scorching Ray is a damage spell and is kind of the premier damage option for most characters who have access to it throughout the game. This is going to stay your best damaging option for most of your career for a lot of characters. It is, you fire 3 rays, so similar to Magic Missile, you can choose multiple targets or fire them all at the same target. They each do 2d6 fire damage, and upcasting gets you an additional ray, which is good because the additional ray is both 2d6, so that's good scaling. You know, we talked about how d12 or whatever is pretty good scaling for leveling up. And 2d6 is better than d12, so that's very good scaling as you level Scorching Ray. And then also Scorching Ray can be split across multiple targets or just does a bunch of damage. I already said it does 21 average damage when you hit with all 3 rays. It's a little easier to hit than it is for enemies to fail saving throws usually, so that's going to apply pretty well. Also, because it's an attack roll, it can critically hit, which matters a lot for a spell that just does a big pile of damage dice. Damage dice really love critical hits, so having Scorching Ray apply lots of damage dice and have a good chance of critically hitting is very good. This is a spell that's sort of similar to Warlock Eldritch Blast. It's going to play out in the same way as Eldritch Blast will, but of course is a leveled spell compared to Eldritch Blast, so the question is how good is it to spend a level 2 spell slot on Scorching Ray? The answer is, if you just want something dead, this is probably your best option. It's going to be a solid role player throughout your career, whether at level 2 or all the way up into the late game. Going to do decent damage. Typically, you're going to want to use this on an enemy, on like a weak enemy who you know has low AC and relatively low hit points that you can pretty reliably actually kill with it, like an enemy spellcaster. But this is just a good spell that will do a lot of damage, and while I'm not normally a fan of damage spells that actually kill things are pretty powerful. Scorching Ray is a great spell, A tier. One thing that's kind of interesting in general about the level 2 spells, just as a note, is how many of the really good level 2 spells are damage spells, which is actually a good thing. Typically, damage spells are weak, but level 2 is the point where damage spells are kind of at their most useful, because you are less likely to have enemies who don't get one-shot by an appropriately applied damage spell, since when you're 3rd level, a lot of enemies are going to have in the range of 20-30 hit points, right? So something like a Moonbeam or a Cloud of Daggers plus a Shove can one-shot enemies pretty reliably, which is part of why these damage spells actually work pretty well as 2nd level spells. And damage spells are going to get consistently weaker as we go up into higher level spells. Level 1 spells are also all fighting with cantrips, so level 2 is kind of the sweet spot for damage spells. C, Invisibility, we've got right here, which is using the wrong icon. So that's the issue here. We're going to have to do some more live HTML. Once again, riveting viewing for everyone, I can only assume. Alright, problem solved. So, See Invisibility lasts until long rest, and allows you to see invisibility. Now, there's a story event in the game that just gets you this permanently, so we do have to mention that that is an option, and something that this spell will inherently be fighting against. This spell is also fighting against a bunch of other spells that just break invisibility. Any damaging effect in Baldur's Gate breaks invisibility, ends the invisibility for most enemies, and so that will allow you to just see enemies. Create Water also applies the wet condition, which ends invisibility on enemies, because they're dripping with water, so you know where they are. And Fairy Fire is a level 1 spell that does this way better. See Invisibility also gives the enemies a dex save to avoid being seen, which is kind of adds unreliability to a situational spell. And you never want your situational spells to also be unreliable, because when the situation where you want them comes up, you want them to work. So a spell that's both situational and unreliable is always going to be bad. See Invisibility is a D tier spell. Even aside from the fact that you can get it for free, there's just better ways to break enemy invisibility with Fairy Fire, with Create Water, with throwing a flask at them. Just very easy to duplicate this spell effect in a much more efficient way. Shatter. Shatter is another damage spell. It does 3d8 thunder damage with a saving throw for half, a con save for half. Again, con saves are a bad save to target, but thunder damage is a very good damage type, so those two things do kind of cancel out. The question is basically, is it worth spending a level 2 spell slot for 3d8 AoE damage, plus 1d8 when you upgrade it? And the answer is no, it's never going to be worth doing that, because Cloud of Daggers exist, which just does more damage. So you would never ever want Shatter compared to Cloud of Daggers. I think there are no characters that... I guess Tempest Domain Cleric is the only character that gets access to Shatter and doesn't get access to Cloud of Daggers. So the fact that Cloud of Daggers just pretty much supersedes this spell in every circumstance makes it a D tier spell, unfortunately. Even if you don't get multiple turns of damage with Cloud of Daggers, you are going to get more damage initially because of the double dipping effect that you get from the ground targeting spells. Silence. Silence is a concentration spell, but it's a ritual, so it doesn't actually cost a spell slot. The only resource you're spending is your concentration and having to have it prepared or know it. It creates a soundproof sphere on the ground with a 20-foot radius, so a huge radius, which both makes characters inside it immune to thunder damage and silences enemies inside it. Silenced enemies can't cast spells or call for help or do a bunch of other things that require talking. They also can't converse with you, which matters for a couple cutscenes. And so silence is a very, very powerful effect with no save. While it won't come up in a lot of fights, being able to start the fight by preventing a spellcaster from casting a spell is very strong. So as long as you have a way to keep them in the silence effect, usually an ally with the Sentinel feat or something like Spike Growth alongside it, which I'll talk about in a second, silence is a ludicrously powerful effect that you absolutely will want for some encounters. Does it rise to the tier of A tier? I don't think so, because most spellcasting enemies will be able to just walk out of it. You have to combo it very specifically with things that prevent them from moving. So you have to really plan your encounters in order to make silence good. The best way, actually, to apply silence is with the silencing arrows or the Susser Dagger or Greatsword that applies silence to enemies hit, preventing them from casting spells, breaking their concentration. Another thing that silence will do is it will stop some legendary actions from certain bosses, which makes it powerful in that sense, but again, on honor mode, but those bosses will often be able to leave the silence bubble. The fact that you can silence an enemy and at least guarantee an attack of opportunity against them is always good, and if you can trap an enemy, because they then have to move out of the silence to cast their spell, and if you can trap an enemy inside the silence by locking them into a corner in some way, or by filling the entire arena with it if you're fighting in a small room, or by having Sentinel or some other way to stop movement, plant growth, spike growth, etc., is a very powerful spell. I'm going to put it in B tier because it's situational, but very, very good when it comes up, especially if you've planned your party around making use of it. I would never recommend not having silence, I guess, though, because it's a ritual, so it doesn't cost you anything to have. Yeah, actually, I'm going to bump it up to A tier. I think that even though it's situational, just because it's so cheap to have silence available to your party, then it belongs in A tier. So I've changed my mind. Spike Growth. This one combos very well with silence. So Spike Growth is a concentration spell that creates an area on the ground, 20-foot radius as well. So again, a very large radius within 60 feet. Which also, one thing to note about spells that can be cast within 60 feet and have a 20-foot radius, right, is that they increase your effective range. If you cast it at the edge of your range, you get 80 feet of effective range on this spell. Now, the enemy at 80 feet distance will be at the exact edge of the effect, so it's not so useful for something with like Spike Growth, but the bigger the radius on a spell, the longer range it is too, which also matters pretty extensively in certain circumstances, just something to keep in mind. The area that it creates on the ground is difficult terrain, meaning there's actually a lot of ways to become immune to your own spike growths on the classes that get it. Rangers and druids both will end up immune to difficult terrain at some point during their career and will be able to freely pass over spike growth. Because it's difficult terrain, it also halves enemy movement speed when they're on it. Enemies who move on it also take 2d4 of piercing damage every 5 feet they move, which is not that much movement. So an enemy in the center of it will have to take 44 damage in order to get out of it. An enemy on the other side of it will have to take 8d4 damage, putting it on par with Cloud of Daggers, but also slowing their movement significantly. Enemies can bypass some of this by jumping, but some enemies in the game can't jump. Some enemies in the game have powerful bonus actions, so costing them their jump is useful anyways. And there's also some arenas where you can really mess things up by putting a spike growth in between you and the enemies. It's also very powerful when combined with other AoE effects like silence. One thing it doesn't combo well with is fire, because the fire will light the spike growth on fire and completely destroy it. So that's something that you definitely want to avoid, and that is a downside for this and all other flammable spells, because there's often secret flammable objects in the game, like torches that you didn't see or didn't think were flammable, candles that are on boxes and are kind of hidden, and so it's very easy when you're positioning a spell like this to accidentally put it on some fire and light it on fire immediately, which is always going to be a problem. But this is still just an incredibly powerful effect. Restricting enemy movement is great. The damage is relevant, not an amazing damage. You're mostly using it to stop enemies from getting to you. This, I would say, is a mandatory pick on every archer or ranged spellcaster, and still very good for who has access to it. Still very good for melee characters, because you can also trap enemies with you. You can, do the Rorschach thing where they're trapped in with you by casting Spike Growth just under both of you, and then in order to get away, they have to move over the Spike Growth. Even if you're not immune to your own Spike Growth, it's probably better for you to have enemies trapped and taking damage, and then you have to take a little damage to follow them, because they've then taken an attack of opportunity and some extra damage. So you can trap enemies with your melee characters, as well as preventing enemy melee characters from getting to you. Great spell, strong role player throughout the game, very powerful spell in lots of contexts. Definitely bring it. A tier spell. Spiritual Weapon. Spiritual Weapon is a bonus action non-concentration, two of my favorite things to say, summon, that creates a weapon. There are 6 types of weapon, but actually secretly there's only 3 types of weapon because they all do the same thing. These will attack. It acts on its own turn, and it attacks for 1d8 of force damage. This is available only to clerics, or via magical secrets, I guess, but it's a cleric spell. And they also, depending on what weapon you pick, get the once per short rest weapon actions of that weapon type. So if you summon a great axe, great sword, or halberd, you get the lacerate attack that makes enemies bleed. If you summon a maul, you get the concussive smash that dazes enemies, preventing their reactions. And if you summon a spear or trident, you get the piercing strike that inflicts gaping wounds, increasing all damage done to that character by 2. Generally speaking, you're going to want to summon a spear or trident. Piercing wounds is the best of those 3 actions, although enemies who have powerful reactions you may want a maul against, or if you want to move your character away from them in the same turn that you're casting Spiritual Weapon. The fact that Spiritual Weapon is a bonus action and not concentration means that you can use it in basically every circumstance, and the fact that it's a summon means it will cost enemies a lot of turns, because you can distract enemies with it, they'll attack it, you can block enemy movement with it. If you put it in a doorway, they'll have to fight it to get through the doorway, and many, many more opportunities besides. The damage from this isn't amazing, but if it attacks 3 times over the course of a long combat, it's done sort of okay damage for a level 2 spell, but it's also probably saved your party like 5 attacks because the enemies are going to be attacking it, and it's actually pretty tough for a summon. It's got okay AC, okay hit points, and resistances to physical damage, which makes it actually significantly more tanky than you might expect. And so that in and of itself is just very powerful. Almost every cleric is going to spend most of their time in this game going Bless plus Spiritual Weapon as their first action in combat, casting 2 of the best spells in the game, and that's part of why clerics are so powerful. The fact that this doesn't take your concentration and is a bonus action means that Spiritual Weapon is going to stay extremely relevant throughout the entire game. Just a massively powerful spell. You can upcast it for more damage and hit points, but don't do that. It's really just to distract enemies, and using your level 2 spell to absorb 3 attacks and do 2d8 damage is an incredible use for your level 2 spell. Awesome spell. Every single cleric should have this. It's not about the damage, it's about the fact that it's a summon. Just an amazing spell. S-tier spell. Warding Bond. Warding Bond is another cleric spell, and it is also non-concentration, and it lasts all day, so also pretty nice. It gives you a +1 to armor class and saving throws on the targeted character, and resistance to all damage. Every single damage you take is halved. However, every time that character takes damage, the other half of the damage goes to the caster. So it basically lets you split damage between your party members. Now, with Warding Bond in Baldur's Gate, the elephant in the room is that you can have camp followers cast this. I did a whole video basically about this called 3.5 Stupid Hireling Tricks or something like that. You can have camp followers cast Warding Bond, and then a character who's not in the party will take half damage, or will take half the damage that your characters would take, effectively doubling the hit point pools of every single character in your party. Obviously, that use case is incredibly powerful, super abusive, way too good for the game, and something that I won't be considering in the evaluation of this spell, which, like all the other camp follower spells, we're going to evaluate as though it's coming out of your actual party's spellcasting. If you're using it that way, it's of course an S-tier spell. It's going to break the game wide open, making you basically take half damage from every encounter. That is incredibly powerful and pretty much the best thing that you can do if you want a smooth run. But, like I said, I'm not going to be considering that use case for rating this spell. So how is the spell when you're actually casting it, like, from one party member to another party member? Let's say you have a cleric, and you want them to take half the damage that your fighter would take, or whatever. Or you can use it to keep a squishy character, like a wizard, alive by having a tankier character take half the damage. The answer is not great. It takes a level 2 spell slot, which is a problem, and spreading out the damage is good, don't get me wrong, and +1 to armor class and saving throws that stacks with other sources of those things is not irrelevant. So there are uses for this spell, but for the most part you're going to be better off just not trying to use your level 2 spells in a way that prevents you from taking damage in the first place, rather than spending those spell slots on mitigating that damage in a way that doesn't even decrease the total damage that your party is taking. It does slightly because of the increased AC, but the splitting damage effect doesn't do that. Are some builds, though, that can kind of break the symmetry of this effect. If you have damage reduction or resistance from another source, like, say, you're wearing a piece of armor that has inherent damage reduction, or you have damage reduction from Heavy Armor Master or something like that, that will apply to damage that you take from Warding Bond, allowing you to split the damage and then reduce it, significantly decreasing the amount of damage that your party takes if a character who's got Heavy Armor Master has Warding Bond up as well. That's a very powerful synergy. So there are some uses for this spell, even outside of the context of it being broken in half when using it with hirelings. So we'll put it in C tier with the assumption that you have built your party around it. Otherwise, I wouldn't recommend casting this spell if you aren't using a build that specifically takes advantage of it. And finally, for level 2 spells, we have Web. Web creates a 13-foot radius, so still a fairly large radius, although in a sort of weird number. AoE effect within 60 feet. Enemies have a dex save when inside it, or they become enwebbed. Enwebbed is a very powerful effect that gives you advantage on attack rolls against that enemy, and they can't move, and they roll attacks with disadvantage if they're making ranged attacks. This is obviously most powerful against melee characters. Preventing melee characters from moving is super strong, because then they can't attack. The main downside of Web is actually that it's flammable, which is a real problem for these on-the-ground AoE effects in Baldur's Gate, like I mentioned with Spike Growth. This can really cause issues with placement. Also, some enemies are immune to Web, but not most. Obviously, don't use it against spiders, because spiders are going to be immune to being enwebbed. But overall, this is just a very powerful effect. For a concentration spell, you are going to potentially take 2 or 3 enemies out of the fight, or just make things very difficult for them. Dex saves are a good one to target against melee enemies, who will typically have good strength and con saves and lower dex saves. So against brute-type enemies in Web can be a very powerful spell. You're not going to cast it every combat, but this is definitely a solid role-playing spell that I'm going to put in B tier. Right, so let's put it all together and just talk about level 2 spells as a whole. This is the level of the damage spells. Level 2 spells are where damage spells really come into their own, and they will fall off significantly after this level. This is by far the highest average rating you're going to see me give to pure damage spells like Cloud of Daggers, like Moonbeam, like Scorching Ray, all of which are great spells that you're going to want throughout the game. The reason for this, like I mentioned at one other point, is that level 2 is the point where your damage spells are significantly better than cantrips. So level 1 spells are all competing with cantrips for damage, and rarely are significantly better than just spending a cantrip. But enemy health pools haven't grown so high that you are unlikely to be able to one-shot some enemies with a spell. At level 2, a lot of enemies have 20, 30 HP, and you can pretty reliably kill them with a Cloud of Daggers or a Moonbeam plus a shove, or with a Scorching Ray plus a weapon attack, something like that, meaning that they're actually still a very viable way to remove enemies from combat, which is the goal. As always in Dungeons & Dragons combat, the goal is to minimize the number of relevant actions that enemies take, and level 2 damage spells let you do that. They also stay good sources of damage throughout the game, and so that's why damage spells actually did really well at level 2, something that you will not hear me say very often. Of course, there are still some stinkers that just are damage spells that do less damage than better damage spells that you will never want to prepare, because damage is quantifiable and linear, so more of it is always better. You also will get a couple solid role players that your characters are going to use forever. Obviously, these spells, especially Misty Step, Spiritual Weapon, Darkness, are just build-defining spells that are going to be critically important for every character who has access to them throughout the game. Misty Step is the most important spell in the game, and every character should get access to it in some way, whether by being able to cast it or by finding an item that allows you to cast it. Very important spell. So there's a couple spells here that are going to stay on your list forever. For the most part, level 2 spells actually do tend to fall off because so many of the good ones are damage spells, which get weaker as the game goes on. Level 2 spells tend to fall off as you reach higher levels, but there's still a couple very strong spells. I think that you will find that at higher levels there are even fewer S and A tier spells. You'll notice, of course, that there's a lot more D and C tier spells than there were at level 1, and that trend is going to continue. Spells get less critical to a build as they get higher level because higher level spell slots are a more powerful resource, and every higher level spell is competing against not only spells of its level, but every lower level spell. Every level 2 spell you have to compare against a level 1 spell, because you can always cast a level 1 spell if you could cast a level 2 spell. So the pool that they're competing against also gets much wider as you level up and gain access to more powerful and a wider array of spells. Overall, I think that level 2 spells are going to be critically important for some builds, powerful role players throughout the game, great source of damage if you're looking for a damaging spell, and just great spells overall. And we'll get to level 3 spells next. Alright, my friends, hope you've enjoyed this video, and of course, as always, feel free to leave a comment, like the video. Both of those things help a ton with the algorithm. Getting these things to have further reach helps me a lot as well, just because this is the kind of video that brings in new viewers. So if you're interested in helping the channel grow, this is the kind of video that it's really important to comment on and like and stuff, because interaction makes the algorithm boost it, and then new people see it and continue to watch my stuff. So I appreciate it very much when people take the time to do that. And of course you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and other strategy game analysis. I'll catch you next time, friends. Cheers.